In the late 1800s, America was growing fast. New cities, new railroads, new dreams. But hidden beneath the rise of progress was something else, something darker. One of the most feared men in American crime history wasn't born in a prison or raised in the streets. His name was Herman Webster Mudgett. He would go on to become H.H. Holmes, a man who used charm, money, and intelligence to kill without mercy. But before the scams and the infamous murder castle in Chicago, he was a boy shaped by a home that knew only control. This is where his story begins. Herman Webster Mudgett, later known as H.H. Holmes, was born in 1861 in the quiet town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire. He was the firstborn of Levi and Theodate Mudgett, a devoutly religious couple who adhered to a strict, no-nonsense upbringing. Levi, a farmer and local business owner, ran a tight household, while Theodate was the epitome of religious discipline. Their home was governed by an unwavering sense of duty and obedience, leaving little room for warmth or affection. It was a foundation that would mold Herman in ways that no one could have predicted. From an early age, young Herman's relationship with his parents was strained, particularly with his father. Levi's cold and harsh demeanor stood in stark contrast to the nurturing care most children receive, while Theodate, though loving in her way, was emotionally distant. In this environment, Herman became withdrawn, often retreating into his own world. He didn't learn to express emotion openly, nor did he ever form deep emotional bonds with those around him. His parents may have believed they were raising a disciplined and obedient son, but in truth, they had raised a boy who would learn to manipulate and deceive for survival. By the time he was a teenager, Herman began to exhibit behavior that hinted at a much darker side. While most children gravitate toward friends, hobbies, or schoolwork, Herman found himself obsessed with the macabre. Death wasn't just a fleeting curiosity, it became his fixation. At a young age, he began to study the human body, often walking through the woods to collect dead animals, dissecting them with an almost clinical curiosity. Unlike most children who would recoil at the sight of blood or death, Herman saw it as a puzzle to be solved, a mystery to be unraveled. This was no innocent fascination. It was the first sign that Herman Mudgett was different from other children. Herman's adolescent years were marked by his increasing ability to manipulate those around him. His charming demeanor allowed him to fool people, and as he grew older, he became skilled at hiding his true nature behind a veneer of civility. He could talk his way out of any situation, convince others to trust him, and manipulate situations to his advantage. By the time he entered high school, Mudgett was a master of deception. What set him apart from his peers, however, was the cold, calculating mind behind his actions. His manipulations were not childish pranks, but calculated moves toward self-interest. He learned early on that he didn't have to play by the rules. He could rewrite them entirely. There were early instances of his cons during his teenage years. He would deceive classmates into giving him money, pretending to befriend them while secretly plotting his next scam. His ability to charm people into believing he was someone he wasn't grew exponentially. But it wasn't just about gaining money or respect. It was about control. Herman wasn't content with simply lying or stealing. He craved power over people, and deception became his tool of choice. He understood that by controlling the flow of information and emotions, he could influence the people around him, bending them to his will. Herman's manipulative skills would only grow more refined over time, and by the time he left Gilmanton, his ability to control situations and people had taken root. But while his peers were focused on their futures, on becoming teachers, farmers, or businessmen, Herman had far grander plans. His ambitions were not confined to simple wealth or recognition. They stretched into darker, more dangerous territories. Territories he would begin to explore when he left his small town for a new life. At the age of 18, Herman Mudgett left his hometown, looking for opportunities beyond the narrow confines of Gilmanton. He moved to the city of New York, where the vibrant, bustling streets offered a stark contrast to the quiet, rural life he had known. This was a fresh start for Herman, a chance to reinvent himself, and he was ready to seize it. The anonymity of the city, its bustling crowds, and its towering buildings provided the perfect cover for a young man with a deepening sense of ambition and a growing desire for control. In New York, Herman enrolled in a medical program at a local college. This was a turning point in his life, an opportunity to hone his skills, both intellectual and practical. However, his intentions weren't driven by a desire to heal or help others. Mudgett wasn't interested in medicine for the same reasons as his peers. While many students dreamed of becoming doctors to save lives, Herman's interest lay elsewhere. The human body fascinated him, but not in the way it fascinated most medical students. He was intrigued by death, how the body could be manipulated, how life could be extinguished. In a sense, medical school gave him the perfect cover, a legitimate path to study the very thing that intrigued him: death. Medical school in the 1880s was a place of intellectual discovery, but it also had a darker side. Anatomy lessons often involved the dissection of human cadavers, and grave robbing was a not-so-uncommon practice among medical students seeking bodies for study. Herman, who had already shown an uncanny ability to deceive and manipulate, quickly adapted to this new environment. He began to associate with individuals who would later play a key role in his criminal life, people who could help him procure bodies for his studies. At the time, this was not an uncommon practice, but Herman's motives were far darker than most. His time in medical school allowed him to continue his studies into death and the human form while expanding his manipulation skills. He learned to play the role of a charming, trustworthy student, someone who could easily blend in with the rest of his peers. But beneath this false persona, his true nature began to emerge. His knowledge of anatomy and human biology would soon make him far more than a mere student. It would provide him with the tools necessary to carry out far darker deeds. During his time in medical school, Herman's deception reached new heights. He learned that he could manipulate more than just people. He could manipulate entire systems, whether it was the medical establishment or the law. His criminal activities took on a new form. He began to create false identities, forging documents, and manipulating records to his advantage. As he became more adept at deception, his need for power over people and situations intensified. In the same way he had used charm to deceive classmates, Mudgett began using it to secure jobs and opportunities that would further his ambitions. He moved around frequently, avoiding long-term ties and leaving behind any evidence of his involvement in shady dealings. His ability to slip in and out of different identities became a hallmark of his character, a skill that would be vital in his later crimes. He began to understand that in order to truly manipulate people, he needed to control how they saw him. The persona of the trustworthy doctor would become his mask, the perfect cover for his darker intentions. While Herman was learning the art of deception and manipulation, his interactions with people began to show a pattern. He used others for his personal gain. Those he came into contact with were often left in the dark about his true nature. But it was not just about money or material gain. Herman sought control. His manipulation grew more complex as he honed his ability to read people, to predict their actions, and to use their weaknesses to his advantage. The small-time cons from his earlier years had transformed into something far more sinister. He was no longer just a young man scamming his way through life. He was laying the groundwork for a far more elaborate scheme. Medical school provided him with the knowledge he needed, but it was the manipulation and control he had cultivated in his youth that would make him a dangerous individual. It was a combination that would serve him well in the coming years, as he took his first steps toward a future that would bring untold destruction. In the years following his departure from medical school, Herman Mudgett realized that the life he had known, one of small-time cons and petty deceptions, was no longer enough. He wanted more. He wanted power, control, and something far darker than what his previous life had provided. It was during this time of reinvention that he shed his past entirely, becoming someone else, H.H. Holmes. The transformation into H.H. Holmes was not just a change in name, but a complete reimagining of who he was. The name H.H. Holmes would eventually be synonymous with death, deception, and terror, but to those who met him in those early days, he appeared simply as another ambitious businessman, a man who exuded charm and sophistication. But beneath the surface, he was calculating, manipulative, and ruthlessly determined. The name change itself was an intentional severance from his old life. Herman Mudgett was a man marked by a history of deception and small-time crimes. H.H. Holmes would be a man without a past, one who could easily slip through the cracks of society unnoticed, while weaving a far darker web. Holmes wasn't merely adopting a new identity, he was becoming a new person. He realized early on that in order to commit the types of crimes he was planning, he needed to be perceived as someone trustworthy, respectable, and, above all, invisible. He understood that in a bustling city like Chicago, a city full of ambition, competition, and change, the ability to blend in would be the key to his success. No one would look twice at him if he appeared harmless, charming, and above reproach. The first step in this reinvention was moving away from his past, leaving behind the cold, strict upbringing in New Hampshire and the small-time scams that had defined his youth. The man who had once been content with small cons and petty thefts now sought to build something far more ambitious. He wasn't just out to trick a few people, he was out to create a legacy, to control lives, and to weave a deadly plan that would leave an indelible mark on history. Holmes's early cons were small but effective, revealing the depth of his ability to deceive and manipulate. He quickly learned that in order to gain people's trust, he needed to appear as though he had earned it. With his smooth, charismatic demeanor, Holmes could easily charm anyone into believing that he was someone they could rely on. He was a master of reading people, knowing exactly what they wanted to hear, and delivering it with perfect precision. His first steps in Chicago were to secure employment and establish himself as a legitimate member of the community. His charm and persuasive tactics allowed him to secure a job at a pharmacy in the heart of Chicago. At first glance, it seemed like any other job. Holmes was simply working as a pharmacist, another respectable profession for a man who had seemingly left his shady past behind. But to Holmes, the pharmacy was more than just a place of work. It was an opportunity to continue his manipulation. It was here that he began to hone his skills in controlling the lives of others. In the pharmacy, Holmes began to execute his first major deception. He befriended the owner, a man by the name of Dr. Robert Livingston. Holmes learned everything he could about the man, understanding his weaknesses and his blind spots. One day, after building the perfect relationship with Dr. Livingston, Holmes saw his opportunity. With a simple lie and a forged signature, he managed to take control of the pharmacy, leaving the doctor out of the picture entirely. Holmes now had complete control over the business, and by extension, the lives of those who worked there. While his manipulation of Dr. Livingston was successful, it was only the beginning. Holmes continued to build a reputation for himself as a reliable businessman, someone who could be trusted with money, property, and even people's lives. He knew that in order to build his empire of crime, he needed to have more than just control over small businesses. He needed a place, a space, where he could orchestrate his larger plans without interference. This was where the idea of the murder castle was born, a place that would serve not just as a hotel, but as the ultimate death trap for those who crossed his path. By 1886, Chicago had become a sprawling metropolis, an industrial powerhouse teeming with opportunity. The city was a hotbed of ambition, and with the upcoming 1893 World's Fair on the horizon, it was the perfect time for someone like Holmes to settle in. Holmes was not just moving to Chicago for business. He was moving to build his empire. He saw a city in the midst of transformation, a city that could provide him with the resources, the anonymity, and the thriving population needed to execute his greatest plan. Holmes carefully selected the Englewood neighborhood as the location for his new venture, a growing area filled with new businesses and housing developments. In Englewood, Holmes saw the potential for both financial success and a perfect environment for his criminal activities. The neighborhood was relatively new, and there were still many open lots available for development. One such lot caught his eye, an empty parcel of land where he would soon build the murder castle. Holmes's plan to construct the murder castle was as meticulous and detailed as any of his cons. He knew exactly what he wanted, a building that would be both a hotel and a death trap. The construction of the building began in 1887, and Holmes was involved in every detail. The layout was designed to confuse and ensnare anyone who entered. The floors were riddled with trapdoors, hidden staircases, and rooms that could be sealed off from the inside. There were soundproof rooms, gas chambers, and secret passages that led nowhere. Holmes's vision was simple: create a place where he could lure his victims, trap them, and kill them without anyone being the wiser. But Holmes's genius lay not only in his manipulation of the physical space, but in the way he presented himself to the world. He worked hard to maintain the facade of a successful businessman. He made sure the construction of the building was slow and steady, always paying workers and keeping them on task, but never revealing the true purpose of the structure. To the outside world, the building was simply a hotel, a place for people to rest, work, and relax. But in reality, it was a trap waiting to be sprung. At the same time, Holmes continued to cultivate his reputation as a respected member of the community. He befriended local politicians, business owners, and even law enforcement officers. He carefully crafted a public persona that exuded charm, generosity, and professionalism. Holmes knew that in order to get away with his crimes, he needed to be seen as a trustworthy and upstanding citizen. This image, coupled with his ability to manipulate those around him, gave him the perfect cover for his more sinister activities. This was no ordinary hotel. The castle, as it would later come to be known, was a dark vision brought to life. A house of horrors designed with every tool necessary to trap, torture, and kill. The construction was methodical, deliberate, and masterminded with chilling precision. Every inch of the building was planned with death in mind. Holmes used the emerging architectural trends of the time to his advantage. The murder castle stood 3 stories tall, with an additional basement and attic. It was intended to look like an ordinary hotel, but the layout was anything but typical. The building was designed to be a maze of twists and turns, with rooms that were connected by secret passageways and hidden doors. Holmes had a singular goal in mind: to create a space that was both functional and deceptive, where victims would never know they were walking into their final moments. He employed a variety of workers to help build the structure, but many of them were never told the full extent of the plans. The construction was slow, taking years to complete, but Holmes never rushed. He needed everything to be perfect, every detail down to the last doorframe, every piece of furniture, every corner of the building, designed to serve his twisted purpose. Some parts of the building were never used at all, while others were rigged to trap people without them realizing what was happening. Holmes, the man of charm and deception, oversaw the entire operation with meticulous care, always keeping the workers unaware of what was truly happening behind the walls. In the end, the murder castle was a twisted masterpiece, an architectural anomaly. It stood at the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets, and from the outside, it appeared to be a well-built, respectable hotel. But behind its charming exterior, there was a labyrinth of death awaiting anyone who dared to enter. The very foundation of the hotel was steeped in lies, and its walls hid secrets that would eventually make it the stuff of nightmares. While the murder castle was outwardly a hotel, its true purpose was far more sinister. Holmes's vision was not just to run a hotel, but to create a machine for murder, one that could operate with efficiency and precision without raising suspicion. The building's design was meant to confuse and ensnare, to ensure that anyone who entered would never be able to escape. Holmes used his knowledge of human anatomy and his understanding of psychology to create a place where he could control every aspect of his victim's experience. Guests would arrive, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. They would be offered jobs, provided with food, and given a place to stay. For the women, the promise of work was often too good to resist. They trusted Holmes because he presented himself as a respectable businessman, a doctor, a man of wealth and power. What they didn't know was that the very rooms they stayed in were designed to be instruments of death. As Holmes continued to build his empire of death, he expanded the hotel to include rooms where he could experiment on his victims. The rooms were equipped with gas pipes that Holmes could activate at will, releasing poisonous gas that would render his victims unconscious before he moved in for the kill. He also built secret rooms with thick, soundproof walls, allowing him to carry out his crimes without anyone hearing the screams of the victims trapped inside. The design of the murder castle made it nearly impossible for any victim to escape. Once they entered, they were trapped, their fate sealed before they even realized what was happening. The hotel was designed not just as a place to sleep, but as a chamber of horrors where death was the ultimate conclusion for those who crossed Holmes. One of the most chilling aspects of Holmes's operations was his ability to lure victims into his web using nothing but charm and manipulation. Holmes was a master at reading people and understanding their desires, fears, and weaknesses. He knew that in order to carry out his plan, he needed to build trust with those around him, especially women who would make up a significant portion of his victims. Holmes used his reputation as a successful businessman to charm women into working for him at his hotel. He promised them jobs as clerks, secretaries, or assistants, making them believe they were entering a respectable business. Many of these women were young, vulnerable, and far from home, seeking work, shelter, and safety. They were easy targets for someone like Holmes, who could offer them all those things with the promise of a future. But Holmes's motives were far more sinister. He wasn't interested in helping these women. He used them as pawns in his larger game. Once he had gained their trust, he would isolate them from the outside world, keeping them in rooms that were carefully designed to make it difficult for them to escape. Some victims were lured by promises of marriage or safety, while others were simply looking for a job in a city that promised opportunities. The women who entered the hotel never knew they had walked into a trap until it was too late. In addition to women, Holmes also targeted unsuspecting businessmen and travelers. He promised them accommodation and employment, and like the women, they trusted him. These men would enter the hotel, unaware that they had become part of Holmes's deadly plan. Holmes knew how to make them feel safe, offering them a place to rest while they traveled, but behind closed doors, they were just as vulnerable as his female victims. Holmes manipulated everyone who came into contact with him, using their trust as a means to carry out his grisly agenda. Holmes's creativity extended beyond secret rooms and hidden passageways. He also designed sophisticated systems for killing and disposing of his victims' bodies. One of the most terrifying features of the murder castle was its gas chambers, which Holmes had installed to quietly kill his victims without leaving a trace. The gas chambers were equipped with pipes that Holmes could activate from behind a hidden wall. Victims who stayed in rooms with gas pipes would unknowingly inhale the deadly fumes, causing them to lose consciousness and eventually die. Holmes could control the flow of gas, ensuring that the rooms were filled with just enough poison to kill, but not enough to arouse suspicion. The gas chambers allowed him to kill without ever laying a hand on his victims, making it easier to continue his operation without drawing attention. Once the victims were dead, Holmes would dispose of their bodies in the building's incinerator. The incinerator was a specially designed furnace that could handle the intense heat needed to burn human remains. Holmes made sure that the furnace was reinforced to withstand the high temperatures, allowing him to dispose of the bodies without leaving any evidence behind. This system allowed him to kill without a trace, making it nearly impossible for anyone to link the disappearances to him. Holmes was not just a killer, he was a predator, and the murder castle was his hunting ground. Every aspect of the hotel, from the design to the operations, was focused on ensuring that his victims never stood a chance. He was methodical in his approach, calculating the risks and rewards with precision. He understood that in order to get away with murder, he had to keep his actions hidden from the public eye. At the heart of Holmes' operation was his ability to manipulate and control. He preyed on people's trust and their need for safety. His victims were unsuspecting, believing they had simply found work or a place to stay. They never knew they had walked into a death trap. Holmes, with his cold, calculating mind, ensured that no one could connect the disappearances to him. The gruesome realities of Holmes's operation became apparent when investigators finally began to uncover the horrors inside the murder castle. They found the secret rooms, the gas pipes, the incinerator, all of the tools Holmes had used to carry out his grisly plan. But by then, it was too late for many of the victims. Holmes had already disappeared, leaving a trail of death behind him. Holmes was an expert at one thing above all else: deception. He understood the power of charm, manipulation, and a well-crafted persona. For years, Holmes evaded suspicion, slipping through the cracks of the law and society with remarkable ease. His success was not due to a lack of suspicion. Many had doubts about him, but rather his ability to deflect, redirect, and distract. Holmes was a man who could convince anyone of his innocence, even in the face of mounting evidence. One of the key factors in his evasion was his mastery of disguise. Holmes was not just a businessman. He was also an actor, playing the role of the respectable doctor, the trustworthy hotel owner, and the charming gentleman. To the outside world, he was the epitome of success. He had carefully constructed a reputation that hid his darker motives. People saw him as someone they could rely on, someone who appeared well-educated, wealthy, and generous. This facade allowed him to blend in seamlessly, making it nearly impossible for anyone to see through his lies. Holmes knew how to manipulate not just individuals, but entire systems. He moved through life like a shadow, staying one step ahead of anyone who might have caught on to his schemes. Whether it was convincing his victims to trust him or persuading the authorities that there was nothing to worry about, Holmes had an uncanny ability to appear unremarkable. He was careful to stay under the radar, avoiding situations that could raise suspicion. Holmes kept his business dealings opaque, his personal life private, and his actions just enough in line with the law to avoid drawing attention. But perhaps the most effective way Holmes avoided suspicion was through his meticulous planning. He made sure that his crimes were well hidden, often carrying out his murders in ways that would leave no trace. The murder castle itself was a key part of his plan. Its design, with hidden rooms, trap doors, and secret passageways, was built with one goal in mind: to conceal his crimes and leave no evidence behind. Holmes knew that if he could keep people from seeing what he was doing, they would never suspect him. And for a long time, this strategy worked perfectly. Holmes also knew when to change his approach. Whenever someone began to get too close to discovering the truth, he would simply move on, either by relocating, switching identities, or eliminating anyone who might have posed a threat. He had no qualms about using murder as a means of self-preservation. For Holmes, the concept of risk was non-existent. He calculated everything with a cold, detached precision. By constantly shifting his location and his relationships, he kept the authorities chasing ghosts, never truly understanding the scale of his crimes. His charm and ability to manipulate were also his greatest weapons in evading suspicion. Holmes didn't just rely on being smart. He relied on the inherent trust people had in him. He knew how to tell people exactly what they wanted to hear, how to promise them a better life, and how to make them feel secure. It was this combination of charm and deception that kept the authorities at bay for so long. Even when things began to unravel, he was able to use his charisma to mislead those around him. But Holmes's biggest advantage was his understanding of human nature. He knew that people were often blind to the darkness around them. They were willing to believe that things were fine because it made them feel safe. Holmes exploited this vulnerability to his advantage, playing on the natural inclination to trust others, especially those who appeared to be doing good. His ability to manipulate people's perceptions allowed him to keep his true intentions hidden, even from those who should have been watching him more closely. For a time, Holmes appeared invincible. No one suspected him, no one saw through his facade, and no one could catch him in the act. He was a master of his craft, and his ability to avoid suspicion was a testament to his skill. The authorities simply didn't know what to look for. They were focused on other crimes, other suspects, while Holmes continued to operate in plain sight. His carefully constructed world allowed him to kill with impunity, and for many years he was able to do so without fear of capture. However, all things come to an end. Holmes's reign of terror couldn't last forever. The very systems he had so carefully manipulated began to crumble, and the first signs of his eventual capture began to emerge. What was once a well-oiled machine of deception slowly started to falter as more people began to ask questions. As the noose began to tighten around him, Holmes found that his greatest skill, his ability to deceive, was no longer enough. Holmes's ability to manipulate those around him was unparalleled. He was a master of using charm as a tool to manipulate people, shaping their perceptions to fit his own needs. His smooth talk, polished manners, and ability to read people made him seem trustworthy to those who encountered him. He knew that in order to carry out his plans, he had to make people believe in him, and he did so effortlessly. Holmes wasn't just charming, he was a master of psychology. He understood the human desire for validation, security, and belonging. He used this knowledge to manipulate those he came into contact with. Whether he was talking to a potential victim, a business partner, or a member of the community, Holmes always knew the right words to say to make them feel important, to make them trust him. This allowed him to build relationships quickly, to create bonds that were entirely false, but felt completely real to the people involved. One of his most effective tactics was his ability to create a sense of dependency. He would make people feel that they needed him, whether it was through offering jobs, promising shelter, or providing security in a time of uncertainty. By offering people something they wanted or needed, Holmes was able to build a sense of obligation, which he would later exploit. He knew how to make people feel that they owed him something, even when they had no idea that they were merely pawns in his deadly game. Holmes's charm wasn't just reserved for women. He was equally skilled at manipulating men. He knew that businessmen, travelers, and even local authorities could be just as easily deceived as the women he targeted. His charm worked across gender, class, and profession, allowing him to build trust wherever he went. He was able to convince people that he was a legitimate businessman, a successful doctor, and a well-respected member of the community, when in reality he was nothing more than a cold-blooded killer. It wasn't just his words that made Holmes so dangerous. It was his ability to act. Holmes was a consummate performer, and he knew how to present himself in ways that made him seem trustworthy. His confident demeanor, his smooth voice, and his carefully crafted image of success allowed him to slip past the defenses of those who should have been watching him closely. People saw what they wanted to see: a man of wealth, power, and charm, and because of this, they trusted him without question. Holmes's manipulative nature extended beyond simple deception. It was a constant, calculated strategy. He knew that in order to carry out his crimes without suspicion, he had to make people feel comfortable and safe around him. He presented himself as someone who could be relied upon, someone who would never harm others. This was crucial to his success. People simply didn't expect that a man like Holmes could be capable of such horrific acts. Through his charm and manipulation, Holmes was able to build a web of trust that concealed his true nature. He convinced people that they had nothing to fear, that he was just another man with good intentions. By the time anyone suspected him, it was already too late. He had already established his power and control over his victims. But Holmes wasn't just a manipulator of people. He was a manipulator of circumstances. He carefully crafted his environment to make it appear as though he was just another businessman trying to make a living. He kept his personal life private, his business dealings opaque, and his relationships distant. Holmes knew that by keeping people at arm's length, he could avoid scrutiny while continuing his deadly operations without interference. For years, H.H. Holmes concealed his monstrous crimes beneath the facade of a respectable businessman, a charming doctor, and a wealthy hotel owner. His smooth-talking charm, ability to manipulate, and seemingly legitimate operations allowed him to slip under the radar. However, a series of disappearances and odd circumstances began to raise suspicions, though the authorities were slow to act. The first significant crack in Holmes's carefully crafted persona came with the disappearance of Minnie Williams, a young woman who moved to Chicago. She had been lured to Holmes with promises of a job and a better life, only to disappear without a trace. For a time, no one questioned Holmes's involvement, as he had carefully constructed his reputation in the community. Once the connection between her disappearance and the murder castle were figured out, law enforcement was forced to act. Detective Frank Geyer, who was already investigating Holmes for various other suspicious activities, was assigned to the case. Geyer, an experienced investigator, found himself facing one of the most challenging cases of his career. Holmes was not just a con man, he was an intelligent and calculated murderer whose crimes were carefully concealed with clever deceptions. Despite mounting suspicions, Holmes's ability to maintain his facade complicated the investigation. His hotel, which looked like a legitimate business from the outside, was actually a death trap, built with hidden rooms and passageways specifically designed to evade detection. Holmes used his charm to manipulate not just his victims, but also those around him, law enforcement officers, local business owners, and others who interacted with him regularly. Many saw him as a trusted figure in the community, making it even harder to suspect him. As authorities gathered evidence, they realized that Holmes had gone to great lengths to cover his tracks. Bodies were disposed of with remarkable thoroughness, leaving little evidence behind. The rooms, secret passageways, and gas chambers in the murder castle were built specifically to conceal his crimes. Investigators struggled to find tangible evidence, and the more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Holmes had orchestrated his operations with chilling precision. It was evident that Holmes was not only a skilled manipulator, but also a master of hiding his true intentions. Holmes's connections in Chicago, including local politicians and business leaders who vouched for his character, allowed him to evade suspicion for longer than most criminals could. These influential connections shielded him from early scrutiny, making the investigation far more difficult. But despite Holmes's best efforts to stay one step ahead, the law eventually closed in on him. As the investigation gathered momentum, Geyer and his colleagues began to uncover crucial details about Holmes's financial dealings, particularly his life insurance fraud schemes. Holmes had taken out several policies on his victims, which immediately raised red flags. The fraudulent policies were a key piece of evidence that linked Holmes directly to the murders. These policies provided a financial motive for the murders and indicated that he had been killing for profit. With this new information, investigators turned their attention to Holmes's financial dealings, which ultimately helped them build a more comprehensive case against him. As they connected the dots between the life insurance policies, missing persons, and the fraudulent activities Holmes had been engaged in, it became clear that they were dealing with a highly organized criminal who had carefully planned and executed his murders. The role of journalists, exposing the truth. While law enforcement worked to connect the dots, journalists played a critical role in investigating and exposing the truth about Holmes. Journalists dug into Holmes's background, examining his history of fraudulent activities, and connecting the disappearances of his victims to him. The press started to investigate Holmes's ties to various fraudulent schemes, which helped expose the extent of his criminal operations. One of the major breakthroughs came from investigative reporters who began to write about the disappearances surrounding Holmes and the growing suspicions about his involvement. The media played an important role in uncovering the story behind the murder castle and putting pressure on law enforcement to take action. In particular, newspapers began to report on the mystery of the missing women, drawing public attention to the fact that Holmes's business dealings seemed suspicious. As the investigation continued, journalists uncovered more details about Holmes's previous fraudulent activities across the country. Their investigative work brought new information to light, providing leads that helped the authorities piece together the puzzle of Holmes's crimes. One of the major figures in the media investigation was a reporter who first began writing about the disappearances in Chicago. His articles about Holmes's shady past and suspicious business dealings exposed holes in Holmes's stories and forced authorities to re-examine his involvement in the murders. His persistent coverage kept the case in the public eye and ensured that pressure mounted on the police to act. The media frenzy surrounding the case brought even more witnesses forward, with former associates and acquaintances of Holmes coming forward to share their experiences. These revelations further validated the suspicions of law enforcement and helped tighten the noose around Holmes. Journalists were instrumental in maintaining public interest in the case and encouraging authorities to dig deeper into Holmes's activities. As public interest in the case grew, more and more people began to come forward with information. Some former employees of Holmes's hotel and people who had crossed paths with him in the past shared their stories with the press, shedding light on his suspicious behavior. Through the media's relentless pursuit of the truth, Holmes's manipulations were slowly unraveled. Although Holmes was the mastermind behind the murders, he didn't operate alone. Many individuals, knowingly or unknowingly, assisted him in carrying out his fraudulent schemes and murders. Some were victims of Holmes's manipulation, while others were accomplices who were either deceived or coerced into helping him. Holmes used his charm and persuasive abilities to recruit others into his schemes. One of the most notable figures in this web of complicity was Ben Pittezel, a criminal associate who was deeply involved in Holmes's fraudulent life insurance schemes. Pittezel, who had been convinced by Holmes to participate in the fraud, paid the ultimate price for his involvement when Holmes murdered him as part of the larger insurance fraud scheme. Holmes convinced Pittezel's wife, who had known about the fraud, that her husband was still alive, further manipulating her into believing his lies. In addition to Pittezel, Holmes also had several employees at the murder castle, some of whom unknowingly helped him facilitate his crimes. Workers who helped build the castle or manage the property were unaware of its true purpose. Holmes kept his operations compartmentalized, revealing only what was necessary to those who worked for him. Many employees noticed strange features in the design of the building, such as hidden doors and rooms, but they didn't understand their true purpose. Some of these employees later testified against Holmes, providing valuable insight into his operations. However, many of them were either too intimidated by Holmes or simply unaware of the true extent of his activities. Their involvement, though indirect, was crucial in maintaining the illusion of a functioning hotel and providing Holmes with the resources he needed to continue his crimes. As the investigation progressed, the authorities began to find more concrete evidence linking Holmes to the murders. The initial clues were circumstantial, unexplained disappearances, and rumors of suspicious activities. But as law enforcement connected the dots, they began to uncover a more disturbing picture of Holmes's crimes. A key breakthrough came when the authorities linked the fraudulent life insurance policies to Holmes. Investigators realized that Holmes had been collecting substantial sums of money from policies on people who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. This gave them the motive for his murders and helped tie him directly to the deaths. However, Holmes's ability to hide his actions made it difficult for the authorities to gather physical evidence. Many of his victims had been disposed of so thoroughly that there was little left for investigators to find. Instead, the authorities relied on circumstantial evidence, witness statements, and financial records to build their case. They also pieced together the testimony of survivors, those who had narrowly escaped Holmes's grasp and were able to provide valuable information. Holmes' capture was not immediate, as he had already fled Chicago and was using multiple aliases to hide his whereabouts. But as the investigation gained momentum, Holmes's deceptive methods began to unravel. The authorities, fueled by the growing body of evidence and the pressure from the public and the media, were able to track him down. Holmes was arrested in Boston in 1894. His capture marked the end of one of the most notorious killing sprees in American history. He was quickly tried for the murder of Ben Petezel in Philadelphia. The trial, which garnered national attention, exposed the full extent of Holmes's fraudulent activities and murders. In 1895, H.H. Holmes, America's first known serial killer, finally found himself standing trial for his horrific crimes. His capture had sent shockwaves through the nation, but the trial would reveal the full scale of his depravity. Holmes, who had evaded justice for so long, now had to face the consequences of his actions. The courtroom drama was intense, drawing the eyes of the public, media, and law enforcement. For the first time, Holmes would have to answer for the murders of Ben Petezel and many others, including women, children, and countless victims whose deaths had remained shrouded in mystery. As the trial began, Holmes's demeanor was startling. He presented himself with the same charm and confidence that had helped him manipulate so many. He had been able to fool so many before, so why not now? He showed little sign of the fear or anxiety that most people would experience in his position. Holmes seemed almost nonchalant about the murder charges against him, approaching the trial as if it were just another business deal to be managed. His cool demeanor and composed exterior initially made him appear like an ordinary man facing the courtroom, but his true nature began to emerge as the prosecution presented their case. Holmes's ability to manipulate continued throughout the trial. He attempted to manipulate both the public and the courtroom. He spoke to the press, tried to charm the jury, and attempted to spin a narrative of his own. He denied the accusations, presenting himself as a victim of conspiracy, and at times suggested that he had been framed. He went to great lengths to maintain his innocence, but it was clear that his lies were unraveling as the prosecution presented their evidence. The public was captivated by his efforts to maintain control over the situation, even as the noose tightened around him. Throughout the trial, Holmes's behavior was calculated, designed to project an image of innocence and sanity. He was not the crumbling, desperate man one might expect after facing the gravity of his crimes. Instead, Holmes played the role of the rational, cool-headed individual who simply had been wronged by others. His attempt to manipulate those around him did not end in the courtroom. He was determined to convince the public, the judge, and even the jury that he had been misunderstood, that the murders were the result of unfortunate circumstances, not premeditated acts of violence. Holmes also tried to manipulate the trial's proceedings. He was known to make subtle statements to the press, giving carefully crafted interviews where he continued to deny any involvement in the killings. His goal was to muddy the waters and cast doubt on the charges against him. He would later argue that his confession had been coerced, even though he had made it willingly. His claims of being a victim of circumstances were an attempt to frame himself as a misunderstood genius, rather than the psychopathic killer he truly was. Holmes also played the role of a calm, collected, and articulate defendant. He knew how to make himself seem approachable and reasonable to those who might question his guilt. His charm, which had served him so well throughout his criminal career, now became a weapon in the courtroom. But the truth was undeniable. Holmes's manipulation could only go so far. As more of his victims' testimonies and confessions were presented, it became increasingly difficult for him to maintain his deceitful front. Every lie he told only seemed to deepen the hole he had dug for himself. As the trial progressed, Holmes's confidence began to slip. The evidence presented by the prosecution was damning. Victims' families gave testimony, and detectives revealed his complicated web of lies. He could no longer hide behind his charm and deception. The public, who had once been captivated by his manipulation, now saw him for what he truly was: a cold-blooded killer who had carefully constructed his life of lies and murders. Holmes had built his facade for years, but in that courtroom, it all began to crumble. The prosecution's strategy was clear: to expose Holmes as the manipulative, calculating murderer that he was. They presented a strong case, revealing the full extent of his fraud, deception, and brutal killings. They focused not just on his crimes, but also on his twisted psychology and manipulative nature. Holmes's fraudulent activities, including his many life insurance scams, were carefully outlined, and the prosecution emphasized how they were a key part of his motives for murder. One of the key pieces of evidence in the prosecution's case was the life insurance policies that Holmes had taken out on his victims, particularly on Ben Peitzel. The prosecution highlighted how Holmes had gone to great lengths to collect the money from these policies, even to the point of killing Peitzel and his children to secure the payout. The use of the fraudulent insurance policies, combined with the testimonies of survivors and victims' families, painted a clear picture of Holmes's calculated efforts to murder for profit. It became clear that his crimes were not random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated plans to manipulate and exploit others for financial gain. On the other hand, Holmes's defense strategy was to maintain that he was not guilty of murder. His attorneys argued that he had been misunderstood, suggesting that the confession he made was coerced. They tried to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the evidence, particularly his confession, which they claimed had been obtained under duress. However, their attempts to paint Holmes as a victim of circumstance, and a man wrongly accused of horrific crimes, fell flat. The overwhelming evidence stacked against him, including his multiple fraudulent activities, the discovery of his murder castle, and the testimonies of his surviving victims, made his defense appear weak and unfounded. In an attempt to create sympathy and to distance himself from the gruesome nature of his crimes, Holmes also tried to frame himself as a misunderstood genius. He suggested that his intelligence had been the reason behind his criminal behavior, claiming that he had been too smart for his own good. This was yet another attempt to manipulate the narrative of the trial in his favor, but it only further alienated the public, who saw through his attempts at evasion. Despite his best efforts, Holmes could not escape the weight of his crimes. The case captivated the public's imagination. Holmes was seen as the embodiment of evil, a man who had been able to hide his true nature behind a mask of charm and respectability. As the trial progressed and more details emerged about his murders, the public's shock and disbelief grew. It seemed impossible that someone who had appeared so ordinary, even likable, could have committed such horrific acts. The media played a key role in sensationalizing the trial, and their coverage intensified public interest. Newspapers published detailed reports on Holmes's background, his fraudulent activities, and the gruesome discoveries in the murder castle. The press painted Holmes as a monstrous figure, adding to the sense of shock and horror that was sweeping the nation. Every new revelation about his crimes seemed more appalling than the last, and the public was left grappling with the realization that they had been deceived by a man who had spent years building a facade of normalcy. As Holmes's trial unfolded, it became clear that the nation had underestimated the depth of his malevolence. He was not just a con man, but a cold-blooded killer who had manipulated everyone around him. The trial revealed a man capable of unimaginable evil, someone who had used charm, intelligence, and manipulation to carry out a spree of murders for personal gain. The public was horrified, but they were also fascinated by the case. Holmes had become a symbol of the dangers of deception, and his trial left an indelible mark on American history. After weeks of dramatic testimony and cross-examination, the jury deliberated and the verdict was finally announced. H.H. Holmes was found guilty of the murder of Ben Peitzel, one of his most significant victims. The evidence was overwhelming, and Holmes's attempts at manipulation had failed. He was sentenced to death by hanging, a fate that seemed almost too mild given the brutality of his crimes. The conviction of Holmes brought a sense of justice to his victims and their families, but it also highlighted the chilling reality of his crimes. Holmes had orchestrated a series of murders with such cold precision that it was hard to comprehend the depth of his evil. As he was led away to await his execution, many felt that this was the only fitting end for a man who had deceived and destroyed so many lives. Despite the conviction, there remained questions about Holmes's true nature. He had confessed to multiple murders, but some believed that he had killed far more people than he admitted. His ability to manipulate, even in the face of death, made some wonder whether he truly understood the gravity of his actions, or if he was simply a psychopath devoid of remorse. Holmes showed little emotion as he awaited his fate, but in his final days, some began to question whether he ever truly felt remorse for his actions. Holmes was executed on May 7, 1896, and with his death, the case that had captivated the nation came to an end. However, his legacy lives on as one of the most notorious and manipulative criminals in American history. H. Holmes is a name that reverberates through the annals of American criminal history. He was not the first murderer in the United States, but his calculated, methodical nature and the scope of his crimes set him apart. Holmes, often considered America's first true serial killer, crafted a legacy that would shape public perception of criminal behavior for generations. His crimes, which spanned multiple states and involved countless victims, were carried out with chilling precision. Holmes's ability to manipulate his victims, law enforcement, and society itself made him a figure of fear and fascination. The fact that Holmes built a murder factory, the infamous murder castle, speaks volumes about his psychological makeup. It wasn't just a place of death, it was a monument to his ego, a physical manifestation of his belief that he could evade the law and manipulate those around him. His crimes were as much about control and power as they were about the brutality of murder. Holmes made sure his story lived on through sensationalized media coverage, court cases, and eventually books and films. But what truly stands out is how his actions changed how America viewed the concept of serial murder. Holmes was the prototype for what would later become a more recognizable type of criminal, the methodical, calculating serial killer. He made the leap from opportunistic murderer to a figure defined by his repetition of crime. His case shocked America and in many ways laid the groundwork for the country's understanding of such crimes. He was a forerunner, influencing not only how criminals would operate in the future, but also how they would be studied, understood, and caught. The public's reaction to the revelation of Holmes's crimes was one of horror and disbelief. The idea that a man could carry out such systematic and brutal killings within a building that was supposed to be a place of safety was unfathomable. The murder castle became a symbol of the darkness lurking behind everyday life. For years, people speculated about the horrors hidden within its walls. The destruction of the building after Holmes's capture was symbolic. Destroying the physical manifestation of his twisted empire did little to erase the psychological scars left on the public. In 1895, after Holmes was arrested and his crimes revealed, the authorities demolished the murder castle, the building that had played such a significant role in his crimes. The destruction of the hotel came not just as an act of justice, but as a desperate attempt to rid the city of the haunting reminder of Holmes's presence. The site where the castle once stood was eventually replaced by a post office. But even after the structure was gone, the legacy of what had occurred there would linger. The physical space, once a labyrinth of death, had vanished, but the psychological impact it had on the public would remain a chilling part of American criminal history. Holmes's manipulation of the public's trust, as well as his ability to deceive the people closest to him, caused a seismic shift in how people saw the world around them. The idea that someone could maintain such a double life, charming, intelligent, and seemingly benevolent by day, and a brutal killer by night, was terrifying. The public's fear and fascination were compounded by the knowledge that Holmes had exploited their deepest trust and vulnerability. When it comes to the number of victims Holmes had, there's a wide chasm between myth and reality. Holmes himself confessed to 27 murders, but he later claimed the number was much higher, Some reports even suggest he could have been responsible for more than 200 deaths. The true number of his victims is, and likely will remain, uncertain. Holmes was meticulous in his ability to erase any trace of his victims. The design of the murder castle, with its secret rooms, trapdoors, and gas chambers, allowed him to dispose of bodies without leaving evidence behind. The bodies of his victims were often burned or buried, making it difficult to definitively identify them. Investigators struggled to piece together the full extent of his crimes because the bodies were often not recovered, and the people who went missing were assumed to have left for reasons unknown. Many of Holmes's victims were transient, workers, women seeking employment, and travelers. Individuals who were more easily forgotten or overlooked by society. The lack of concrete evidence has led to rampant speculation. Some believe that Holmes's actual body count was likely higher than what he confessed, and some researchers have gone so far as to suggest that he may have committed even more murders in other cities, as he moved frequently. His ability to assume multiple identities, manipulate others, and erase his tracks has led some to theorize that Holmes could have been responsible for even more deaths than anyone can confirm. However, the sheer mystery surrounding his true body count remains one of the darkest parts of his legacy. H.H. Holmes is often considered the archetype of the modern serial killer. His case marked a turning point in how Americans understood the nature of these criminals. Before Holmes, the idea of a serial killer, a person who committed multiple murders over an extended period, was not widely known or discussed. Holmes, however, was one of the first to embody this disturbing phenomenon, and as such, he helped shape the cultural understanding of what a serial killer was. Holmes's crimes were studied in later years by criminologists and psychologists, who sought to understand the psychological makeup of serial killers. The murder castle became a symbol of the depths of human depravity. Holmes's ability to maintain a facade of respectability while secretly carrying out gruesome murders would later be a common theme in studies of serial killers. His behavior, his manipulation, his charm, his ability to hide in plain sight, began to emerge as psychological markers of a certain type of predator. Holmes's case was a precursor to the studies that would eventually lead to the development of forensic criminology, the field of study that analyzes criminal behavior in the context of psychological and social factors. In many ways, Holmes was one of the first individuals to be studied in terms of the psychology of a serial killer, how he could compartmentalize his life and engage in such violent behavior without feeling guilt or remorse. His case has provided invaluable insight for modern criminal psychologists and continues to be referenced in the study of psychopathy and criminal behavior. Holmes was executed by hanging on May 7, 1896, but his legacy extends far beyond his death. His trial, the sensationalism surrounding it, and the horrific nature of his crimes cemented his place in American criminal history. But even in death, Holmes managed to keep his name in the public eye. After his execution, Holmes became the subject of books, films, and countless media reports. His story has been retold in various forms, adding to the mythos surrounding his name. The murder castle, the sensational details of his life, and his cold-blooded acts of murder have continued to fascinate and horrify the public. His case remains one of the most well-known examples of serial murder in American history. However, as the years went by, Holmes's story became distorted, adding layers of myth to his legacy. His tale became a blend of fact and fiction, where his true number of victims, his manipulation of the justice system, and his ability to deceive people became exaggerated. This mythologizing only added to his impact on popular culture, ensuring that his name would be remembered, albeit with a mix of fact and fiction. The psychological complexity behind Holmes's actions, along with his influence on the criminal world and public perception of serial murder, has made him a case study in both criminology and media culture. His legacy endures not just in his crimes, but in how he shaped the way America and the world understood the pathology of serial killers.